Cormac Smith has worked in public relations and corporate communications for over 3 decades. In 2016, he travelled to Ukraine to take up a special appointment as the strategic communication advisor to Pavlo Klimkin, then the foreign minister of Ukraine. He was attached to the British embassy in Kyiv, but was embedded in Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the first foreigner to hold such a role. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who has supported the channel, especially the recent fundraisers, Jiggers Paw and Car for Ukraine. Links to all of those, of course, are in the description of the video. Thank you also to everyone who has become a patron or bought me a coffee. It is incredibly helpful to maintain the work of the channel. It's my great pleasure today to be joined once again by Cormac Smith. Obviously, we haven't spoken for a couple of weeks. A lot has happened, and to some extent, I would say the masks have come off. In many of our conversations, you have been pretty clear that you did not think for a long time that Trump would act as an ally or a partner to Ukraine. Are you even taken aback by the extent of the betrayal, the extent of the abuse and the abusive relationship that the US seems to have to Ukraine and potentially to its allies as well?
Jonathan, I am taken back. And I'll mention a few things. Almost a year ago, I was looking up some of my old interviews, and I did a television interview almost a year ago where I said that I believed that Donald Trump was in Putin's pocket. And the interviewer challenged me on that, and I was then challenged by Greg Svensson, who is the chair of Republicans abroad. And I was asked to back it up, and I had no compunction whatsoever in saying yes, I do believe it. Then a few months ago, the morning after he was elected, I did a podcast where I said, if there's one silver lining and one silver lining only, it may be that Europe finally wakes up, stands up, and comes together, and increases our defense spending, takes our defense spending right. I believed at that stage that there was a deal to be done with Donald Trump. I believed that there was a deal to be done that if he was talking about 5%, if we went to 3%, that he would say, right, we will stay in the game with you for a year. So I have been taken aback because I did not believe that Donald Trump would be so vindictive, so vicious and cruel, so absolutely despicable, and so absolutely clearly against the side of the victim, democratic Ukraine, who has been genocidally invaded for over 3 years now, and so very, very clearly doing everything that Kremlin and Putin would wish. It's very, very interesting. On a daily basis, I follow is it Steve Rosenberg's reports out of Moscow, the BBC's great Moscow correspondent, and he reflects on the utter joy in the Russian media and coming out of various people and so forth. And I said in my first interview that they were popping the champagne corks and opening the best vodka, not just in the Kremlin, but all across the Russian Federation after what we saw on Friday night. Could I say one more thing on
Yes.
Friday night? We are constantly hearing people saying, well, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that, and Zelensky could have done better, and maybe he wasn't well enough briefed, and and maybe he should have worn a suit. And this is ridiculous. I went out and said this was an ambush. And as a former advisor, I can sit there with hindsight and say, well, maybe I should have said, Mr. President, this is how you should open them. I don't believe it would have made the slightest difference how Zelensky dressed or what he said. I think this was an ambush, and they were out to get a particular result out of it. I think they wanted to humiliate him. They wanted to portray this as master slave. This broke every rule of diplomacy, of good manners, of hospitality. Let's just bring this down to basic norms. You do not invite an important guest to your house and treat him in the way that the Americans treated Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday night. It was absolutely gut-wrenchingly disgusting, and we need to remember that. Now, I have a theory myself that in terms of ending this war within 24 hours, which Donald Trump has previously suggested, that it's become very, very clear to him in his conversations with Putin, which of course are not played out in public as this one was, that there is no evidence that he is getting any traction at all. Putin's demands remain maximalist, not only to retain all the land that he has seized, but in fact to go further and retain more land, to retain those parts of the four oblasts that he has declared forever Russia, to completely neuter Ukraine's armed forces, to leave Ukraine vulnerable for when Putin decides to come back for more. But we have absolutely no evidence that Trump is acting as an honest broker here at all. All of the evidence coming from every angle suggests that Donald Trump is on Vladimir Putin's side and very much against Ukraine. And the fact that genocide has been carried out in Ukraine, and the fact that a decision taken only in the last few hours to cut off Ukraine's use of American intelligence, that will lead directly, because it will blind Ukraine's air defenses over their cities. And that is likely in the next 24, 48, 72 hours to lead to the deaths of more innocent civilians and women and children in particular than otherwise would have happened. So, we need to stop on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and recognize that what we saw on Friday night was a first in civilized history. We have never seen that sort of behavior from the supposedly democratic leader of one country hosting the democratic leader of another country who has been seeing his country ravaged for 3 years. It was an ambush, but it was despicable.
And it was abusive. I mean, I've done an episode and just done an interview this afternoon with Marcy Shore where we analyze the abusive aspects of that. Now, I have a lot of people who are trying to influence, a lot of colleagues who are trying to influence the Republican Party. And I see a spectrum of the sort of whatabouts that you're talking about there. And this is quite difficult to deal with. There are some who repeat the sort of "it was disrespectful" line and don't yet accept that it was a trap. There are others that accept that it was a trap, but say that Zelensky shouldn't have walked into it because he may have been given a heads up, which he chose to ignore, and he refused advice which was proffered. There are others who will say, yes, it's a trap, etc., and it was wrong, and I'm embarrassed. And then they'll look at what's happening now, and they'll see that as a direct result of that press event. Whereas, I don't want to put words in your mouth, it seems to me that actually many of these decisions, if not all of them, had already been taken. And the measures that we are seeing probably don't have, couldn't have been changed. The course would not have been changed had Zelensky been supine or had he been himself, which was, the defender of his people. Hopefully, I haven't put that idea in your head. What's your take on that?
Well, I don't know what to say, Jonathan. My take is that I honestly don't believe that Volodymyr Zelensky could have got any different outcome on Friday to what he did. I went out and said it was an ambush. I believe it was completely premeditated. I believe they did it for a reason. I'm inclined to think that the great peace deal, which Donald Trump has promised from months before he got elected, and from the day of his election, he has found out with Vladimir Putin that it's simply not possible. And I believe that for the optics of his own people, that he needed to shift the blame for any failure onto Volodymyr Zelensky. And I think a lot of people have, partially at least, taken that bait, and they must step back from it. There was only there was only one there was only this was as black and white as it comes. This was right and wrong. You do not you do not treat somebody, and then when the president of 40 million people, who has been probably the greatest war leader of the 21st century, I think I can say that with some confidence, and what he has seen, the ravages that he has seen on his people, with over 140,000 war crimes now recorded and being investigated by the prosecutor general in Ukraine with the full support of the international community. And, some of the most horrendous war crimes. And this man lives with this every single day. And he had the temerity to challenge President Trump and Vice President Vance and to say, but don't you know that Putin does not keep his word? And he was attacked by Vance for being disrespectful and litigating this in front of the American people. We need to give our head a little wobble. I said, this is not normal. Speaking to President Zelensky as if he was a naughty child and telling him, you are not grateful enough. Ukrainians in general, I have found out, are extremely grateful people. And I know there's been a film made where somebody clipped up something showing President Zelensky thanking America and the American people and the government 97 times or something. The first thing we hear every time President Zelensky meets a world leader is to thank them and their country for the support they give. So this was alternative universe stuff. And he Trump. But we need. I'm trying to. I'm going on at this because I'm trying to get to something, because it's like, when we deal with Russian disinformation, we talk of the fire holes of falsehoods, don't we? But we're seeing a very different but yet similar fire hose of falsehoods coming out of Donald Trump's mouth and out of the mouths of the Trump administration. Pick just one example: the $350 billion which Trump keeps saying that America has pumped into supporting Ukraine. This has been audited. It is the best estimate. It is 119 billion.
Even that is inflated, though. Even that, by
Yes.
some reports, is dramatically inflated, because many weapon systems are costed as if they were new list price, but they were not. They were many, close to expiry date or secondhand.
Possibly the majority of the weapon systems were close to expiry date. They were due to be retired. Retiring those weapon systems involved a cost. Instead of scrapping them, they gave them to Ukraine, which the Ukrainians made very good use of and were very grateful for. There's also, within the auditing, there is an estimate that 70% of that, and if we do, let's round it up, Jonathan. Let's say it's 120 billion. It's still 1/3 of what Donald Trump keeps, and Emmanuel Macron, corrected him. I think Keir Starmer may have corrected him. And, he has been corrected over and over again, but he keeps pumping out the same figure. And unfortunately, we know that more and more people, because they keep hearing it from the President of the United States, will believe that. But I mean, let's talk, because some of this is so ridiculous. We're just accepting it.
And some of it's smoke and mirrors. Some of it is, in fact, most of it is there to distract us from what is really happening. And it seems that, unfortunately, the media and many commentators, social media, are endlessly distracted by this political puppet show, this clown show that is unfolding. What is going on behind the scenes? Because we now see intelligence data being pulled We see military support being suspended. We see military aid that was in transition being halted. We see weapons systems being disabled. We'll almost certainly see Starlink disabled in the coming days as well. We may even see the US pull out of NATO. This is the strategy. Well, these are the tactics which ladder up to a strategy which seems to be to support a Russian victory, or at least a declaration of maximalist victory over Ukraine. That seems to be the underlying intent. No matter how, we have twists and turns, and we will over the next couple of weeks, more pressure applied to Ukraine, maximalist demands, and then they'll flip and say the opposite thing the next day. This is all smoke and mirrors. What is going on underneath all this?
Well, if I can just add one more point there, if it is the White House playing very, very tough, well, it took 2 days, and Volodymyr Zelensky put out a very emollient statement and wrote a letter to Donald Trump, which Donald Trump read out on his address to the both houses last night, and seemed to accept that this was sufficient to get the sides talking again, and that the deal, very, very clear indication from President Zelensky that he was ready to sign the mineral deal. Let's come back to the mineral deal in a little bit and try and unpick what that actually means. So even after this, we have the announcement that aid is being frozen. And then we have the latest announcement late today that intelligence has been frozen, which is, we've already said, completely devastating. So it's very, very hard. It's very, very hard to know. But what we can see is that everything that has been done is weakening and causing panic in Kyiv and on the battlefront with Ukraine's armed forces. And everything that is being done is absolutely, one, it is delighting Russian media and society broadly, and the Kremlin administration specifically. We know that. We have the evidence every single day of Rosenberg, the great BBC Moscow correspondent, who reports daily on the reactions from the Kremlin and in the Russian newspapers. So we know that what it's actually doing is weakening Ukraine and strengthening Russia. And this latest thing is going to give a Russia that is under serious weakness. Donald Trump has effectively come riding to their attention like a knight on a white charger. The purpose of it, you and I can guess. I don't think Donald Trump is somebody who cares about the world order. He wants to break up that world order. I think you've already said that. He sees 3, possibly 4 great power blocks. Obviously, China, the United States, and Russia. Possibly India. We can debate about that. And he sees these power blocks carving the world up into spheres of influence. A massive retrograde step over the last 80 years.
We sort of talked about this before we hit the camera. I don't think he sees the EU as a power block. Unfortunately, he sees it as something to bully and plunder.
And actually, Jonathan, could I cut in there? I think he does see the EU as a power block. I think he despises and he hates the EU. And of course, he came out recently and came out with the absolutely ridiculous statement that the EU was set up to screw the United States.
The problem where he got that from? I mean, he got that from his mate Vladimir.
That's right.
Quite
but
clearly.
the problem with the EU, we are, I'll get my figures wrong since Brexit, but we are a population of 500 billion. We are an economy about 15 times the size of the Russian economy. You'll forgive me, you might know the figures as to where we compare with the United States, but
it'd be half a billion, I think, of the population. Yeah,
500 million population compared to 340 million Americans. But I'm looking at the size of our economy. But basically, the EU as a bloc or Europe as a bloc can stand up to Putin, can stand up to not just Putin, can stand up to Donald Trump. And that is one of the reasons why he despises it. So I think he does see Europe as a threat, and that is why he wants to break Europe up and break Europe apart. I think possibly um, Vance ran off at the mouth a little bit yesterday and caused great offence when he referred very, very clearly to the United Kingdom and France as some random countries who haven't fought a war in 30 or 40 years who might be able to put 20,000 boots on the ground in Ukraine. Well, that's done us a great favour because I've never seen anything that has quite united right and left across our country here in the UK. And I think that has sent shockwaves across our European partners as well. So I'm not quite sure that we're down yet. I don't think it matters what Donald Trump wants. What Donald Trump wants is what's good for Donald Trump. I think the message is now that as Europe, we need to look to ourselves. There are signs that we're starting to do that. We need to look to our own security. America is lost.
It is, or at least it needs to save itself. As I'm telling my GOP friends that if they want to save their country, they need to create an alternative to the Republican Party, and they need to start fighting, not collaborating, colluding, and helping to create the smokescreen. Let's focus on Europe, because Europe is where the fight is, and that Europe is where the resistance to Putin must be held if it's to succeed. What concrete steps? I think we've talked about several of them, but there are some new ones to add. There's the 300 billion. There's massive defense increases, building up army, etc. But there's a couple of others. One which we talked about right at the start, I think in our first conversation, was closing the skies. But there are others which have now emerged, which were unthinkable just a few weeks ago. And that is, along with these massive defense procurement budgets that are now starting to be approved, that they should be 100% sourced from allies in Europe and not from the States, as well as that 300 billion once it's seized being used purely in the European defence sector. These are new measures, and we could perhaps talk with Philip on another occasion about nuclear deterrence and how we could perhaps shift to sourcing the next generation of deterrence from within Europe to really mess up or imply threats to the US defence industry. Now, what's your view? What are the absolute priorities now for Europe?
Invest in our defense. The absolute number one priority is that we finally get on and we seize this nearly 300 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets, because this is going to, if we think that America has put in 120 billion over the last 3 years and Europe has put in probably 134 billion, that alone is going to give us a lot of time to rearm and get the armaments into Ukraine that Ukraine needs. I think also I saw a report today that the European Union may be finally prepared to suspend voting rights from Viktor Orban and Hungary, and that is an essential step that, in my view, is long overdue, because we know that Orban is Putin's creature at the heart of the EU. So we need to neuter Orban. We need to finally seize and make available those frozen Russian assets, which I believe are in the region of 300 billion. I heard Bill Browder talk about this.
Dollars, yes, in dollar terms, that's right.
Today.
200 billion euros, $300 billion, that's right.
Yeah. So I think the time for procrastination is over. We can have no more doubts. And, I've been saying for, I think, a year, and I think I've said it on some of the discussions you and I have had today. I said it's our money and guns today or our daughters and sons tomorrow. And, we're getting very, very close to a point where we will see, our generals, certainly in the UK, have been telling us that we need to be ready to fight a war with Russia by the end of the decade. I think the events of the last 4 or 5 days have brought that an awful lot closer, because Vladimir Putin has been thrown a lifeline by Trump and his creatures that certainly I didn't envisage. So all the signs that Europe is waking up very, very fast. Our prime minister at the moment, Keir Starmer, playing a blinder. Politics aside, playing a blinder along with Emmanuel Macron and the likes of Katja Kallas. Great, huge hope coming out of Friedrich Merz. A lot will depend on the final shape of that coalition that he manages to put together. But Merz has already indicated that he wants to flood Taurus missiles into Ukraine. Taurus that is very, very similar to our Storm Shadow and the French Scalp, but has twice the range.
And essential now that HIMARS and ATACMS are potentially
That's
either
right.
fully invalidated or far
Yeah.
less accurate than they were before.
Yeah. And I mean, there are issues of American components I don't know about Taurus, but certainly in Scalp and Storm Shadow. But I think there needs to be we have seen great diplomatic outreach from the French president and the British prime minister in the last week in particular, even to a point of issuing a second state visit from the king to Donald Trump. My God, that must have stuck in the craw. But there's got to be a point where we stop being supplicant and we stop crawling and we stop playing the slave. As Europeans, we stand up. It was very interesting, Jonathan. I'll just finish on a point, and I reflected on this recently. It was the Ukrainians, and it was one Ukrainian in particular, actually, my great friend Alexei Mikheyev, who's currently the ambassador out in Berlin, in a conversation very early in my time in late 2016, really taught me the importance of Europe for world democracy, for the rules-based order. I'm not sure either of us could have foreseen this at the moment, but when we look at, and the other thing to remember, you and I grew up in the peace dividend, and we grew up pretty comfortable homes, and we grew up taking peace for granted. And horrendous wars, the type of which we see in Ukraine for the last 3 years, well, the last 11 years actually, was something consigned to the past in Europe, certainly. And we got far, far too complacent about this. There's a statistic that I read recently. There's in their most recent report, I'll get this right, it's the Economist Intelligence Unit. And they produce an audit of democracy across the world. And what they have shown is a steady decline. They measure democracy by, I don't know, something like 50 or 60 measures. And they have noted a steady decline in the proportion of the world's population who live under democracy. And actually, in their latest report, the proportion of the world's population who live under what they call full democracy is 7.9%. It's less than 8%. Now, there's a big chunk then, I think, and again, I don't have the figures in front of me, so people will bear with me. It's about 39% of the world then live under what is termed as flawed democracy. This is all in open source and available online. Democracy audit, the Economist Intelligence Unit, if I got that correct. And the United States, most of us in Europe, Britain, in Ireland, in Germany, in the Netherlands, we sit in Japan, we sit in what are termed as full democracies. The United States doesn't. Canada does. The United States doesn't. The vast majority of South America doesn't. And I think what we have seen in the last 43 days, since 47 was inaugurated, is we have already seen a huge slide in democratic values in the United States, and we really don't know what sort of shape the United States will be in 4 years' time. But remember, Jonathan, and people listening into this, that the values that we so cherish and we so take for granted, and I went to school in the 70s and university in the early 80s in Dublin, and I studied politics and economics, and I, studied the various regimes, and I was always a student of history. And I thought that the things we're witnessing now were consigned to the history books, the great documentaries like The World at War, and my granduncles who fought Hitler, who I spoke to, and they told me stories of the war. I thought this was all in history. And suddenly we have become so soft and so complacent, which, by the way, is how Russia has always characterized us in the West, as weak and soft and effete and ready for the picking. Well, we really need to, all of us at every level. There'll be somebody out there who'll say, "Oh, Cormac, why didn't you?" Or Jonathan, "Why didn't you go off to the front line?" Well, I'm 62 with a broken body, and I'm probably not going to go to the front line because I wouldn't last very long anymore. But you and I will do our bit in other ways, and we all have a part to play in civil society, and because this is a multifaceted battle. This is a battle for every single one of us. It was von Clausewitz, a great Prussian strategist, who said, to fight a war effectively, you need three elements have to be in perfect harmony and functioning. One is your government, two is your armed forces, and the third is your society. So I guess, Jonathan, you, I, and literally thousands, tens of thousands of good people across Europe who most of us will never hear of, who, I don't know, maybe just give up their time to raise funds and drive trucks and across Europe into Lviv and Kyiv and so forth to bring humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, or raise money to buy drones, or whatever they do. We all have a part to play. Some will actually fight, like my friend Sean Pinner, who I had the great joy of having lunch with a couple of weeks ago. And they're now making a film of his book, Live, Fight, Survive. That's one to look out for. But we all have a part to play. And we need to realize that the easy times are over. And we're going to have to make sacrifices. And that sacrifice might be as little as we have to pay more tax. We have to accept that some of what are actually luxurious public services may be cut back, because the British government, for example, has had a really, really hard time getting from 2.3 to 2.5%. All of a sudden, they're starting to talk about maybe 3%. It's going to be 5, 6, 8% above if we have to do this.
Well, Cold War levels, absolutely.
Yes, we're talking about 6%. But let me finish off on one more point. Deterrence. And you and I, Jonathan, grew up in the age of deterrence and mad, mutually assured destruction. There was something very, very interesting said by General Sir Roland Walker, who's the current head of the British Army, shortly before Christmas last year. He said, the British Army is not ready to fight. And if we're not ready to fight, we're not ready to deter. The best way to, and I'm not a military man, but I have military men who are friends, and I listen very closely to what the military men say. And they're very clear that the best way to avoid war is to prepare for war. It was Machiavelli who said in The Prince, what was it, 700 years ago, that the reputation for power is more important than power itself. Well, in Europe, we have lost that reputation. We've lost the ability to inspire fear, to check the enemy, to say to the enemy, you do not come near us, because if you do, we will hit you back so hard, and we will do this on behalf of our people. We have lost that. Now, there is a sign that we may get that back. And I don't say this as a warmonger. I hope to live out, I don't know how many years I have, 20 or 30 or whatever. But the rest of my life, I hope to live it out in peace. And I hope to spend my time traveling around Europe, certainly visiting and Ukraine, which is part of Europe, visiting my friends. Can't really do that at the moment. That's what's threatened. So I don't want war. But if we don't prepare for war, and if we don't seriously prepare for war, what more evidence do we need than we have a cruel, brutal enemy who will take advantage of us? I started learning this in 2014 when I started going to former communist countries to talk on government communications. Then I went to Ukraine in 2016 and I worked at the heart of their government for 2 years and I made friends. And my education really took off. And that's when I started to say, we need to see Russia through Ukrainian eyes and through the eyes of the people in the Baltics and maybe Poland and other people who have been
Finland as well, who
unfortunate.
have
Finland,
few
yes,
delusions.
absolutely. Absolutely. So sorry, that's a bit of a stream of consciousness. Did I answer your question? You asked me what we needed to do. We need to
I think
wake up.
so, yeah. I think it
We
is.
need
We
to
need to
wake
wake
up,
up. And a series of
and we need to
practical.
realize that it's not just yeah, you and me are you're an old man in your 50s, I'm an older man in my 60s. We've all got something to do. And it's that, going back to von Clausewitz, it's government, it's army, it's civil society. And actually without a functioning civil society. And I guess for that, the one final thing that I'd say, our leaders, and our leaders have been very bad at this up to now. Our leaders need to explain to us, not so much to us, we will do everything we can to help our leaders explain. But our leaders need to explain to our citizens what the stakes really, really are.
Definitely. I did episodes to try and create opportunities for the Trump team. If you are minded to beat Russia, this is what you could do. And they absolutely had that power. They have that power even now to effect a swift end to the war through Ukrainian victory. That needs to pivot now to creating ideas and opportunities for our leaders, but also now a sense of absolute urgency. So hopefully we will explore these in frequent conversations, and we will try to make sure that those episodes are seen by people who have the ability to take actions off the back of them.
And myself and Jonathan are not warmongers. We're far, far from it. But it's an appeal to please wake up and see the danger that we are in. And it's not to be left to other countries or other people in our own societies. This is a wolf that has now come to our door, and it is incumbent on every single one of us to look to ourselves and to see what role we can play, be it large or small, in strengthening our societies and our countries to defend the values that we have grown up to take for granted, which are now under threat. No doubt about it.
Cormac, thank you. I look forward to the next time, and hopefully day by day we will see the stiffening of spines in Europe in the way that's required. For today, though, thank you so much.